Welcome to my channel Sleep Audio Stories. Thank you for watching. Video, subscribe, and like my channel.
The Pioneers of Pikes Peak by Basil Tozer. It was a perfect night, about the end of June, the sort of night common enough in Colorado at that time of the year. I remember it, for at the end of the game I rose from the card table and strolled out into the cool, refreshing air. Overhead the stars were shining with extraordinary brilliancy, in a sky so clear that one seemed almost to hear them winking. The moon had not yet risen above the range of mighty peaks which tower into the heavens until their crests gradually vanish into great belts of clouds, and at night seem to touch the lowermost of the celestial bodies. But a sort of halo, gradually broadening, served to show that presently the moon herself would shed a flood of light from the very summit of the highest peaks down into the little village nestling at the feet of the mighty range, and now practically wrapped in slumber. No sound broke the perfect stillness without. The very houses seemed to sleep. It was only when I re-entered the heated atmosphere of the smoky bar-room, where my companions, grown tired of card-playing, were now quietly conversing, that I noticed an odd-looking and apparently elderly stranger seated alone beside a little window at the further end of the room. The window was open, and he was staring through it vacantly, only interrupting his reverie now and again in order to blow a long cloud of smoke into the air. As I seated myself among my companions, I cast a glance of inquiry in his direction. "He came in 5 minutes ago," one of them answered. "Who is he?" "Some crank, I suppose. He has hardly stirred since he sat down there." Though the room was a public one, only ourselves and the stranger now occupied it. "What is he staring at?" someone asked presently. "Pikes Peak, apparently," replied Watson, who had called the stranger some crank. Though the words were spoken in an undertone, the crank evidently overheard them, for he turned his head and frowned. Then he resumed his former position, his vigil. Watson tapped his forehead significantly, and presently conversation drifted. It drifted from one topic to another, until the subject of American ways and customs, of America in general, of American scenery and landscapes, came uppermost. "And who really was the first to reach the top of Pikes Peak?" Watson asked, looking round at us. "Not Pike himself," somebody answered, somebody who had been reading up the subject. It was Norton, I think. "They say that a man... Look out, you fellows!" For the stranger had left his seat and was approaching us with a slow, stealthy tread. His eyes oddly dilated. As he advanced, we instinctively turned to face him. A man of immense proportions and well over 6 feet in height. He could not have been over 50 years of age, though he looked quite 60. His hair was white and rather long. He had evidently been handsome in his day, but now the face, neck, and hands were disfigured with numberless little sunken blotches, in some ways resembling, though in reality quite unlike, the pits left by smallpox. He wore an old drab suit, a coon cap, thick boots, and leather leggings. "Who did you say first saw Pikes Peak?" he asked in a threatening, hollow voice. He had dropped into a chair upon the opposite side of the table beside me. As he spoke, he looked me full in the eyes, and, placing both elbows upon the table very deliberately, rested his chin upon his fists. Norton, whom he had interrupted, came to the rescue. "I believe that..." "I first saw it. But do you know the story of our ascent?" "I know only what I've read and been told," Norton said. "You yourself have ascended Pikes Peak?" "I have." "You've seen the summit, then?" "Yes." "And what did you notice there that struck you most? There, 15,000 feet above the sea's level." "Why, scenery that was perfectly grand." Yes, I know. Grand, magnificent, marvelous scenery. I know all that, but what else did you see?" He paused. "Surely it is there," he muttered. "Surely it is still there. It must be there. It must be there. Who could have removed it, eh? He continued aloud. Who could have taken it away? Tell me that. Norton had an inspiration. What train of thought led up to that inspiration, he says to this day he cannot guess. Do you mean the stone? Instantly the stranger's expression changed. He looked round at us all quite intelligently. It is there, then? He inquired eagerly, bending forward across the table. Of course it is there, Norton and Watson replied in one breath. Who could have taken it away? Watson added, glancing towards us significantly and suppressing a smile. We were growing interested in this poor, demented creature. I can give you the inscription word for word, Norton said, wishing to propitiate him. Do! What is it? Tell me, what is it? The inscription says, this stone is erected in memory of William Dawkins, James Weston, and Walter Hillier, pioneers of Pike's Peak who were devoured by mountain rats while endeavoring to reach this summit. Ah, he ejaculated, greatly relieved. I am glad it is there. I am glad it is still there. Do you know the story of my friends? The story of those pioneers? He had grown suddenly calm. He seemed suddenly to have regained his reason. No, tell it to us, said Watson, carelessly blowing a cloud of smoke across the table. But first, what will you take, sir? And won't you try a cigar? Brandy, he exclaimed. Then I will tell you all. All! Our interest and curiosity were now thoroughly aroused. We could see that the stranger was not a common brawler. He was quite sober, too, and though his mind was evidently unhinged, it was equally evident to us that he had intervals of lucidness. This seemed to be one of them. With provoking deliberation, he reloaded his pipe. The glasses were refilled. We noticed that he poured brandy into his tumbler until it was 3 parts full. Just then the moon shone over the summit of the famous peak, and from where we sat, the outline of the glorious mountain could be clearly discerned. Watson drew the stranger's attention to it. An odd, bitter smile flitted across his face. It was the first time that we had seen him smile. He sighed once, but did not utter a word. Again his gaze became riveted upon the gigantic peak. Pike never would, never could have reached it. He tried to several times. Finally he stood upon a hill near the stalactite caves at the base of my mountain, and pointing with his finger at the summit, said, No mortal man will ever tread that peak. Again he paused. But we were determined to. Our friends shook us by the hands and bade us farewell. But you're fools, they said. You will never come back. You don't know what you may meet in those mountains. You know what Pike said when he came back? You know the tales he told and some of the things he would not tell? Don't go, oh, don't go, my wife cried in agony. I loved her, yet I forced her from me. She was but a unit. In the success of our enterprise lay the wealth of those sands. I told her that to comfort her. It was the last time I saw her alive. My comrades, may God help them, had no wives. You are married, they said all along. You should not come, but I was determined to go. Early in the morning we started. We took with us arms, food, and drink for many days, and the bare necessities of life. We carried everything ourselves. We knew where and how Pike had failed. We should succeed. A week later we were fairly launched. Also, we were fairly in the midst of difficulties. The work was terribly severe, but we had determination, strength, and courage. We had expected to find obstacles, and in this we certainly were not disappointed. Here, enormous boulders which had to be circumvented. There, unlooked-for waterfalls and ravines that delayed us, besides vegetation so thick that in places we had literally to hack our way through it. All this impeded our progress enormously. And then the unknown dangers that Pike had hinted at. There might be snakes and reptiles of sorts hitherto never heard of, concealed among those immense boulders. There might be death-dealing plants all around us. Such plants flourish in South America. There might be. Indeed, we did not know what there might not be. But of course we did not pause to consider these things. He paused, however, in order to take another great gulp of brandy. It seemed to stimulate him. His eyes glistened. Over a fortnight went by. We were growing more and more accustomed to meeting difficulties and to overcoming them, for many obstacles at first sight insurmountable proved in the end to be less formidable than we had anticipated. And as we gradually mounted higher and higher, our spirits steadily rose as if in sympathy. Far down in the valley, we had once or twice during our progress caught glimpses of this very townlet, now called Colorado Springs, also the village of Manitou. Tiny villages indeed they were in those days, and as we saw them from those great heights, they looked like chessboards stretched out upon the vast expanse of prairie. And still we fought our way upward, always upward. How long our expedition had been started, I cannot quite remember, when the nature of the surroundings gradually changed greatly. In place of rock and black soil, we now found vast tracts of the sandy formation. The undergrowth was still dense, however, though here and there thousands upon thousands of slim fir trees lay rotting upon the ground, evidently swept down by some terrific storm. For storms in these mountains sweep down trees as a reaping machine sweeps down standing corn. Sometimes we came upon broad open spaces swept clear apparently in early days by giant waterfalls, long since dried up. Then as we penetrated still higher, the temperature, of course, became colder and colder, the atmosphere more and more rarefied, the vegetation at the same time naturally decreasing in density and the trees in size. Even the boulders grew smaller. Indeed, they now looked as though in prehistoric times they had all been flung together by a tremendous seismic disturbance, many of them being crushed to pieces in the process. "Have you noticed," one of my comrades remarked one day as we prepared to rest and refresh ourselves, "what a quantity of insects there are up here? And the rats, too, are getting more plentiful. We seldom see any of those gray squirrels now." As he spoke, he stamped his foot upon an immense brown spider that was running away. Its body burst with a crack, and glutinous liquid spurted out all round his boot. Almost instantly, several more spiders ran out from beneath a large stone as though to ascertain what had happened. They stopped. For a moment, they seemed for all the world as if they looked at us, with a malignant, vindictive expression. Then they scuttled away. I believe I felt several of those spiders scampering over my face last night. He continued, "You fellows had better be careful. I am told they bite like the mischief. These mountains are famous for them, and just look at that!" A couple of large rats were chasing an enormous spider across a long, flat boulder. A moment later, spider and rats disappeared over the edge. "They say the mountain rats will devour any living thing," Weston said presently. "They will eat us if we don't watch them," he ended in jest. During the earlier part of the afternoon we had made good progress when suddenly, to our surprise, we came upon a large sloping tract of bare white sand. The sun, still high in the heavens, shed its rays slantingly across it, and at first sight the sand seemed to be alive with small moving bodies. "Talk of spiders," Dawkins said, laughing. "Did you ever see anything like that?" We had long ago in previous expeditions grown accustomed to surprises. Few things astonished us now. Never in our lives, however, had we seen such an assemblage of lucky insects, as some senseless folk call them. There must have been thousands upon thousands of them running about in every direction, colliding with one another and tumbling over one another, apparently for no particular reason. The sight made me think of a gigantic ant's nest overrun with mammoth ants, and an odd sort of smell that for several days had pervaded the air, and caused us to wonder more than once whence it came. Here struck our nostrils with renewed strength. The smell was the smell of spiders. Now as we stepped forward into this open tract, a strange thing happened, for the entire space, which a moment before had been alive, became in an instant motionless. The spiders were all there right before us, but of one accord they had stopped running. Oddly enough, too, every spider was now facing us, Instinctively, we felt that we had become objects of intense curiosity. And as we stood there, interested and amused, we could distinctly see the spider's great eyes sticking out and evidently watching us. The sight would have given women, and many a man for that matter, the creeps, as I believe a certain sort of nervous affection is called. We rather enjoyed it. "Pish, you hideous things," Dawkins said, pitching a pebble into their midst. In less than a minute, hardly a spider was to be seen. "If we describe that sight when we get back, we shall be called liars, to say the least," Weston said, glancing at his watch. "I've seen insects in my time, but never anything like that. Why, it's past 3 o'clock. The offensive smell was still strong in the air, and as we progressed it increased. Once or twice it became almost unbearable. We had now a long stretch of clear going before us, so we hastened to avail ourselves of it by advancing briskly. And still we saw spiders at every turn, spiders running in under every stone, spiders by the hundred sunning themselves on every rock and boulder, great brown spiders with fat, oval bodies, and with thick, hairy legs bent in grotesque curves. I kicked over a stunted little tree that lay rotting. Ugh, quite 200 or 300 spiders must have scuttled away from under it. "This is getting to be beyond a joke," Hillier, who seldom spoke and was generally considered surly, suddenly said. "I tell you what it is, these spiders will go for us." "Like Weston's rats," Dawkins said, laughing at him, and we were still chaffing Hillier and Weston when Dawkins happened to look around. "Why, Harry!" he exclaimed. There was anxiety in his tone, and I felt his hand grip my shoulder. And no wonder. Though anything but a coward, Dawkins could not help at once realizing what we all realized a moment later, namely that Hillier's evil omen was more than likely to come true, and realizing at the same instant our utter helplessness should such a thing occur, a sickening sense of fear had come over him. For there, barely 50 yards away, a reddish-brown mass, gradually assuming the form of a crescent, was steadily, swiftly gliding over the sand, steadily and swiftly overtaking us. And as it approached, we could see thousands upon thousands of spiders hastening towards it from every side and quickly increasing in size. The swarm, when we first saw it, must have covered between 12 and 15 square feet. Before it had glided over another 20 yards of sand, the entire mass was nearly 1/3 as large again. Yet a sort of horrible fascination kept us rooted to the spot where we now stood watching the swarm approach. In order to brace up our courage, we told one another that the spiders could not be pursuing us at all, that if we moved aside they would pass us by. But in our hearts we knew that we tried to think a lie, and when we moved aside in order to convince ourselves, the creeping crescent immediately swayed round towards us and seemed, if anything, to advance more quickly. The stranger poured out another tumbleful of brandy, swallowed about 1/3 of it, and growing more and more excited, continued. Suddenly the intense horror of the situation flashed across my mind and struck terror into our hearts. For what could we do to avert the terrible fate that threatened us? Savage animals we might have coped with, treacherous human beings even we might have bested, but now we were face to face with a peril totally unexpected, utterly loathsome and unassailable. "Our only chance lies in flight," Hillier said bitterly. "Flight? And where shall we fly to? The top of the mountain, I suppose. Look there, Hillier." It was Dawkins who spoke, and he spoke in tones of scorn. Looking round us, we now saw what we had not noticed before. We were surrounded. Everywhere we saw spiders approaching, in brown gliding crescents of varying sizes. And over 100 yards away, the largest and darkest mass of all could clearly be distinguished, also winding its way along the sand, also approaching, also enclosing us. And as this great crescent surged undulatingly, unswervingly across hillocks and irregularities in the surface of the sandy soil, it resembled the great waves of a sluggish, turbid stream leaving a factory sluice. "Fire into them!" I exclaimed, slipping a couple of shot cartridges into my gun. The 2 charges cut a lane into the approaching wave, but almost instantly the lane closed up. and the undulating mass advanced as if nothing had happened. Together, Dawkins and Weston fired 4 barrels. Rather a broader lane this time, but again it closed up. I had reloaded. "Give them a volley," Weston called out. "That may turn them." We did so, but by the time the smoke had cleared away, the swarm had well nigh resumed its normal size and shape. Could we sweep a lane with our 8 barrels and then rush through it? No, that was obviously impossible. And the width of the waves was too great. And still, recruits were pouring in upon every side as we fired volley after volley into the quickly approaching swarms in the vain hope of turning them. The distant ravines rang again and again with echoes. "My God, we are done for," came despairingly from Hillier, as for the 20th time he closed his gun with a snap. Our barrels had now become almost too hot to hold, and still the hideous, crawling waves, which must have contained trillions of spiders, were fast approaching with a strange swaying motion and rapidly narrowing our little circle. In a few minutes they would be upon us, overrunning us, dragging us down. Already many stragglers were running up our legs and over our bodies. Now the first swarm was so near that we could distinctly hear it, rushing upon us, and the smell, how it still hangs in my nostrils. For a moment the stranger stopped. His pupils were widely distended. His limbs trembled. He clutched the table frantically in order to support himself. Suddenly I saw several spiders run up Weston's face and fix upon his eyes. With a scream he dashed them away, but as he did so his eye began to swell, for the brutes had bitten him badly. He stopped again. He was quivering all over with the excitement. The brandy was taking effect. Suddenly he dashed from his seat to the furthermost corner of the room. "Keep them from me! Keep them off!" he cried, glaring wildly all round the floor. "Look at them now! Look at them! Ah! God help me! Help me! Help me!" He sprang to right and left, then towards the door. Perspiration was pouring down his face. Then suddenly he snatched blindly at the imaginary spiders running up his sleeves and legs, running up his body, running over his head, over his face, over his eyes, into his mouth. It was a dreadful sight. "Stop him!" Watson cried, jumping from his seat and rushing towards him. But as he approached, the maniac, a blindly directed blow from the latter's fist nearly stunned him, and the innkeeper and 2 rough-looking men entered the room. "Hold him, boys," the innkeeper said calmly. As the 2 men pounced upon the stranger, the innkeeper sauntered towards us. "Poor fellow," he said. "I always have to be ready for him. Look at him now. Yet the doctors pronounce him sane. He often is sane, of course, but when I heard him starting on the spiders and on brandy as well, I knew what to expect." "Is there any truth in his spider story?" "Any truth? It's all truth. At least that's my belief. Though I was quite the lad at the time the expedition started. I can remember it well. 4 of them there were, all strong and hearty when they set out. 2 months later, he came back. Did he alone escape? He alone came back quite done for and disfigured all over with red blotches. Afterwards, they turned into pits. Look at them now on his face and neck. They are all over his body, too. All over every inch of him. Some years later, another expedition went up and reached the summit, but they always maintained that rats, not spiders, devoured those poor fellows. So they set up a stone with an inscription upon it at the top of the mountain. You have seen it, no doubt. What do you yourself think they were killed by?" "Think? I don't think anything. As sure as you were standing there, they were eaten up by swarms of great spiders, as Mad Harry has told you. I've heard him tell the story often enough, and he always tells the same story. But when he drinks brandy while he's telling it, he nearly always gets into that state sooner or later, and I get these men to hold him until he recovers. Besides, those marks are not rat's bites. They are not a bit like rat's bites. No, I believe that what he says about the rats is true. That is, that a perfect army of them suddenly came down upon the spiders and routed a lot, but not before the other 3 men had succumbed or had been so sucked out of blood that they soon died of exhaustion. It's a horrible place, that mountain," he said, looking at its rugged peak so clearly outlined in the moonlight. though you can go up one side of it now by the track, easily enough. You don't know what horrors may exist in other parts of it. Many a man has gone into those mountains, but very few have ever returned.
The Glamour of the Snow by Algernon Blackwood, Chapter 1. Hibbert, always conscious of 2 worlds, was in this mountain village conscious of 3. It lay on the slopes of the Valais Alps, and he had taken a room in the little post office where he could be at peace to write his book, yet at the same time enjoy the winter sports and find companionship in the hotels when he wanted it. The 3 worlds that met and mingled here seemed to his imaginative temperament very obvious, though it is doubtful if another mind less intuitively equipped would have seen them so well defined. There was the world of tourist English, civilized, quasi-educated, to which he belonged by birth, at any rate. There was the world of peasants, to which he felt himself drawn by sympathy, for he loved and admired their toiling, simple life. And there was this other, which he could only call the world of nature. To this last, however, in virtue of the vehement poetic imagination and a tumultuous pagan instinct fed by his very blood, he felt that most of him belonged. The others borrowed from it, as it were, for visits. Here, with the soul of nature, hid his central life. Between all 3 was conflict, potential conflict. On the skating rink each Sunday the tourists regarded the natives as intruders. In the church the peasants plainly questioned, "Why do you come? We are here to worship, you to stare and whisper." For neither of these 2 worlds accepted the other, and neither did nature accept the tourists, for it took advantage of their least mistakes, and indeed, even of the peasant world, accepted only those who were strong and bold enough to invade her savage domain, with sufficient skill to protect themselves from several forms of death. Now Hibbert was keenly aware of this potential conflict and want of harmony. He felt outside, yet caught by it, torn in 3 directions because he was partly of each world, but wholly and only one. There grew in him a constant, subtle effort, or at least desire, to unify them and decide positively to which he should belong and live in. The attempt, of course, was largely subconscious. It was the natural instinct of a richly imaginative nature seeking the point of equilibrium, so that the mind could feel at peace and his brain be free to do good work. Among the guests, no one especially claimed his interest. The men were nice but undistinguished, athletic, schoolmasters, doctors snatching a holiday, good fellows all. The women, equally various, the clever, the would-be fast, the dare to be dull, the women who understood, and the usual pack of jolly dancing girls and flappers. And Hibbert, with his 40-odd years of thick experience behind him, got on well with the lot. He understood them all. They belonged to definitive, predigested types that are the same the world over, and that he had met the world over long ago. But to none of them did he belong. His nature was too multiple to subscribe to the set of shibboleths of any one class. And since all liked him, and felt that somehow he seemed outside of them, spectator, looker-on, all sought to claim him. In a sense, therefore, the 3 worlds fought for him, natives, tourists, nature. It was thus began the singular conflict for the soul of Hibbert. In his own soul, however, it took place. Neither the peasants nor the tourists were conscious that they fought for anything, and nature, they say, is merely blind and automatic. The assault upon him of the peasants may be left out of account, for it is obvious that they stood no chance of success. The tourist world, however, made a gallant effort to subdue him to themselves, but the evenings in the hotel, when dancing was not in order, were English. The provincial imagination was set upon a throne and worshipped heavily through incense of the stupidest conventions possible. Hibbert used to go back early to his room in the post office to work. It is a mistake on my part to have realized that there is any conflict at all, he thought, as he crunched home over the snow at midnight after one of the dances. It would have been better to have kept outside it all and done my work. Better, he added, looking down the silent village street to the church tower. And safer. The adjective slipped from his mind before he was aware of it. He turned with an involuntary start and looked about him. He knew perfectly well what it meant, this thought that had thrust its head up from the instinctive region. He understood, without being able to express it fully, the meaning that betrayed itself in the voice of the adjective. For if he had ignored the existence of this conflict, he would, at the same time, have remained outside the arena. Whereas now he had entered the lists. Now this battle for his soul must have issue. And he knew that the spell of nature was greater for him than all other spells in the world combined. Greater than love, revelry, pleasure, greater even than study. He had always been afraid to let himself go. His pagan soul dreaded her terrific powers of witchery even while he worshipped. The little village already slept. The world lay smothered in snow. The chalet roofs shone white beneath the moon, and pitch-black shadows gathered against the walls of the church. His eyes rested in a moment on the square stone tower with its frosted cross that pointed to the sky, then traveled with a leap of many thousand feet to the enormous mountains that brushed the brilliant stars. Like a forest rose the huge peaks above the slumbering village, measuring the night and heavens. They beckoned him, and something born of this snowy desolation, born of the midnight and the silent grandeur, born of the great listening hollows of the night, something that lay twixt terror and wonder, dropped from the vast wintry spaces down into his heart, and called him. Very softly, unrecorded in any word or thought his brain could compass, it laid its spell upon him. Fingers of snow brushed the surface of his heart. The power and quiet majesty of the winter's night appalled him. Fumbling a moment with the big unwieldy key, he let himself in and went upstairs to bed. Two thoughts went with him, apparently quite ordinary and sensible ones. What fools these peasants are to sleep through such a night! And the other, those dances tire me. I'll never go again. My work only suffers in the morning. The claims of peasants and tourists upon him seemed thus, in a single instant, weakened. The clash of battle troubled half his dreams. Nature had sent her beauty of the night and won the first assault. The others, routed in dismay, fled far away. Chapter 2. Don't go back to your dreary old post office. We're going to have supper in my room, something hot. Come and join us, hurry up. There had been an ice carnival, and the last party, trailing up the snow slope to the hotel, called him. The Chinese lanterns smoked and sputtered on the wires. The band had long since gone. The cold was bitter, and the moon came only momentarily between high, driving clouds. From the shed where people changed from skates to snow boots, he shouted something to the effect that he was following, but no answer came. The moving shadows of those who had called were already merged high up against the village darkness. The voices died away. Doors slammed. Hibbert found himself alone on the deserted rink. And it was then, quite suddenly, the impulse came to stay and skate alone. The thought of this stuffy hotel room, and of those noisy people with their obvious jokes and laughter, oppressed him. He felt a longing to be alone with the night, to taste her wonder all by himself there beneath the stars, gliding over the ice. It was not yet midnight, and he could skate for half an hour. That supper party, if they noticed his absence at all, would merely think he had changed his mind and gone to bed. It was an impulse, yes, and not an unnatural one. Yet even at the time it struck him that something more than impulse lay concealed behind it. More than invitation, yet certainly less than command. There was a vague, queer feeling that he stayed because he had to, almost as though there was something he had forgotten, overlooked, left undone. Imaginative temperaments are often thus. An impulse is ever weakness. For with such ill-considered opening of the doors to hasty action may come an invasion of other forces at the same time, forces merely waiting their opportunity, perhaps. He caught the fugitive warning, even when he dismissed it as absurd, and the next minute he was whirling over the smooth ice in delightful curves and loops beneath the moon. There was no fear of collision. He could take his own speed and space as he willed. The shadows of the towering mountains fell across the rink, and a wind of ice came from the forests where the snow lay 10 feet deep. The hotel lights winked and went out. The village slept. The high wire netting could not keep out the wonder of the winter night that grew about him like a presence. He skated on, keen, exhilarating pleasure in his tingling blood, and weariness all forgotten. And then, midway in the delight of rushing movement, he saw a figure gliding behind the wire netting, watching him. With a start that almost made him lose his balance, for the abruptness of the new arrival was so unlooked for, he paused and stared. Although the light was dim, he made out that it was the figure of a woman, and that she was feeling her way along the netting, trying to get in. Against the white background of the snowfield, he watched her rather stealthy efforts as she passed with a silent step over the banked-up snow. She was tall and slim and graceful. He could see that even in the dark. And then, of course, he understood. It was another adventurous skater like himself, stolen down unawares from hotel or chalet and searching for the opening. At once, making a sign and pointing with one hand, he turned swiftly and skated over to the little entrance on the other side. But even before he got there was a sound on the ice behind him. With an exclamation of amazement he could not suppress, he turned to see her swerving up to his side across the width of the rink. She had somehow found another way in. Hibbert, as a rule, was punctilious, and in these free and easy places perhaps especially so. If only for his own protection, he did not seek to make advances unless some kind of introduction paved the way. But for these two to skate together in the semi-darkness without speech, often of necessity brushing shoulders almost, was too absurd to think of. Accordingly he raised his cap and spoke. His actual words he seems unable to recall, nor what the girl said in reply, except that she answered him in an accented English with some commonplace about doing figures at midnight on an empty rink. Quite natural it was, and right. She wore gray clothes of some kind, though not the customary long gloves or sweater, for indeed her hands were bare, and presently when he skated with her, he wondered, with something like astonishment, at their dry and icy coldness. And she was delicious to skate with, supple, sure, and light, fast as a man yet with the freedom of a child, sinuous and steady at the same time. Her flexibility made him wonder, and when he asked where she had learned, she murmured. He caught the breath against his ear and recalled later that it was singularly cold, that she could hardly tell, for she had been accustomed to the ice ever since she could remember. But her face he never properly saw. A muffler of white fur buried her neck to her ears, and her cap came over her eyes. He only saw that she was young, nor could he gather her hotel or chalet, for she pointed vaguely when he asked her up the slopes. Just over there, she said, quickly taking his hand again. He did not press her. No doubt she wished to hide her escapade, and the touch of her hand thrilled him more than anything he could remember. Even through his thick glove he felt the softness of that cold and delicate softness. The clouds thickened over the mountains. It grew darker. They talked very little, and did not always skate together. Often they separated, curving about in corners by themselves, but always coming together again in the center of the rink. And when she left him thus, Hibbert was conscious of, yes, of missing her. He found a peculiar satisfaction, almost a fascination, in skating by her side. It was quite an adventure, these two strangers with the ice and snow and night. Midnight had long since sounded from the old church tower before they parted. She gave the sign, and he skated quickly to the shed, meaning to find a seat and help her take her skates off. Yet when he turned, she was already gone. He saw her slim figure gliding away across the snow, and hurrying for the last time round the rink alone, he searched in vain for the opening she had twice used in this curious way. How very queer, he thought, referring to the wire netting. She must have lifted it and wriggled under. Wondering how in the world she managed it, what in the world had possessed him to be so free with her, and who in the world she was, he went up the steep slope to the post office, and so to bed, her promise to come again another night still ringing delightfully in his ears. And curious were the thoughts and sensations that accompanied him. Most of all, perhaps, was the half-suggestion of some dim memory that he had known this girl before, had met her somewhere, more, that she knew him. For in her voice, a low, soft, windy little voice it was, tender and soothing for all its quiet coldness, there lay some faint reminder of the two others he had known, both long since gone, the voice of the woman he had loved and the voice of his mother. But this time, through his dreams, there ran no clash of battle. He was conscious, rather, of something cold and clinging that made him think of sifting snowflakes climbing slowly with entangling touch and thickness round his feet. The snow, coming without noise, each flake so light and tiny none can mark the spot whereupon it settles, yet the mass of it able to smother whole villages, wove through the very texture of his mind. Cold, bewildering, deadening effort with its clinging network of 10 million feathery touches. Chapter 3. In the morning, Hibbert realized he had done, perhaps, a foolish thing. The brilliant sunshine that drenched the valley made him see this, and the sight of his work table with its typewriter, books, papers, and the rest brought additional conviction. To have skated with a girl alone at midnight, no matter how innocently the thing had come about, was unwise, unfair, especially to her. Gossip in these little winter resorts was worse than in a provincial town. He hoped no one had seen them. Luckily, the night had been dark. Most likely none had heard the ring of skates. Deciding that in the future he would be more careful, he plunged into work and sought to dismiss the matter from his mind. But in his times of leisure the memory returned persistently to haunt him. When he skied, luged, or danced in the evenings, and especially when he skated on the little rink, he was aware that the eyes of his mind forever sought the strange companion of the night. 100 times he fancied that he saw her, but always sight deceived him. Her face he might not know, but he could hardly fail to recognize her figure. Yet nowhere among the others did he catch a glimpse of that slim young creature he had skated with alone beneath the clouded stars. He searched in vain. Even his inquiries as to the occupants of the private chalets brought no results. He had lost her. But the queer thing was that he felt as though she were somewhere close. He knew she had not really gone. While people came and left every day, it never once occurred to him that she had left. On the contrary, he felt assured that they would meet again. This thought he never quite acknowledged. Perhaps it was the wish that fathered it only. And, even when he did meet her, it was a question how he would speak and claim acquaintance, or whether she would recognize himself. It might be awkward. He almost came to dread a meeting, though dread, of course, was far too strong a word to describe an emotion that was half delight, half wondering anticipation. Meanwhile, the season was in full swing. Hibbert felt in perfect health, worked hard, skied, skated, luged, and then at night danced fairly often, in spite of his decision. This dancing was, however, an act of subconscious surrender. It really meant he hoped to find her among the whirling couples. He was searching for her without quite acknowledging it to himself, and the hotel world, meanwhile, thinking it had won him over, teased and chaffed him. He made excuses in the similar vein, but all the time he watched and searched and waited. For several days the sky held clear and bright and frosty, bitterly cold, everything crisp and sparkling in the sun, but there were no signs of fresh snow, and the skiers began to grumble. On the mountains was an icy crust that made running dangerous. They wanted the frozen, dry, and powdery snow that makes for speed, renders steering easier, and falling less severe. But the keen east wind showed no signs of changing for a whole 10 days. Then, suddenly, there came a touch of softer air, and the weather-wise began to prophesy. Hibbert, who was delicately sensitive to the least change in earth or sky, was perhaps the first to feel it. Only he did not prophesy. He knew through every nerve in his body that moisture had crept into the air, was accumulating, and that presently a fall would come. For he responded to the moods of nature like a fine barometer. And the knowledge this time brought into his heart a strange little wayward emotion that was hard to account for, a feeling of unexplained uneasiness and disquieting joy. For behind it, woven through it rather, ran a faint exhilaration that connected remotely somewhere with that touch of delicious alarm, that tiny anticipating dread, that so puzzled him when he thought of his next meeting with his skating companion of the night. It lay beyond all words, all telling, this queer relationship between the two, but somehow the girl and the snow ran in a pair across his mind. Perhaps for imaginative writing men, more than for other workers, the smallest change of mood betrays itself at once. His work at any rate revealed this slight shifting of emotional values in his soul. Not that his writing suffered, but that it altered subtly, as those changes of sky or sea or landscape that come with the passing of afternoon into evening, imperceptibly. A subconscious excitement sought to push outward and express itself, and knowing the uneven effects such moods produce in his work, he laid his pen aside and took instead to reading that he had to do. Meanwhile, the brilliance passed from the sunshine, the sky grew slowly overcast. By dusk, the mountain tops came singularly close and sharp. The distant valley rose into absurdly near perspective. The moisture increased, rapidly approaching saturation point when it must fall in snow. Hibbert watched and waited. And in the morning the world lay smothered beneath its fresh white carpet. It snowed heavily till noon, thickly, incessantly, chokingly, a foot or more. Then the sky cleared. The sun came out in splendor, the wind shifted back to the east, and frost came down upon the mountains with its keenest and most biting tooth. The drop in the temperature was tremendous, but the skiers were jubilant. Next day the running would be fast and perfect. Already the mass was settling, and the surface freezing into those moss-like, powdery crystals that make a ski run almost of their own accord with a faint shishing, as of a bird's wings through the air. Chapter 4. That night there was excitement in the little hotel world, first because there was a bal costume, but chiefly because the new snow had come, and Hibbert felt drawn to go. He did not go in costume, but he wanted to talk about the slopes and skiing with the other men, and at the same time... there was the truth, the deeper necessity that called. For the singular connection between the stranger and the snow again betrayed itself, utterly beyond explanation as before, but vital and insistent. Some hidden instinct in his pagan soul, heaven knows how he phrased it even to himself, if he phrased it at all, whispered that with the snow the girl would be somewhere about, would emerge from her hiding place, would even look for him. Absolutely unwarranted it was. He laughed while he stood before the little glass and trimmed his mustache, tried to make his black tie sit straight, and shook down his dinner jacket so that it should lie upon the shoulders without a crease. His brown eyes were very bright. I look younger than I usually do, he thought. It was unusual, even significant, in a man who had no vanity about his appearance and certainly never questioned his age or tried to look younger than he was. Affairs of the heart, with one tumultuous exception that left no fuel for lesser subsequent fires, had never troubled him. The forces of his soul and mind not called upon for work and obvious duties, all went to nature. The desolate wild places of the earth were what he loved, night and the beauty of the stars and snow. And this evening he felt their claims upon him mightily stirring. A rising wildness caught his blood, quickened his pulse, woke longing and passion too, but chiefly snow. The snow whirled softly through his thoughts like white, seductive dreams, for the snow had come, and she, it seemed, had somehow come with it, into his mind. And yet he stood before that twisted mirror and pulled his tie and coat askew 12 times, as though it mattered. What in the world is up with me, he thought. Then, laughing a little, he turned before leaving the room to put his private papers in order. The green morocco desk that held them took down from the shelf and laid upon the table. Tied to the lid was the visiting card with his brother's London address, in case of accident. On the way down to the hotel he wondered why he had done this, for though imaginative, he was not the kind of man who dealt in presentiments. Moods with him were strong, but ever held in leash. It's almost like a warning, he thought, smiling. He drew his thick coat tightly around the throat as the freezing air bit at him. Those warnings one reads of in stories sometimes. A delicious happiness was in his blood. Over the edge of the hills, across the valley, rose the moon. He saw her silver sheet of the world of snow. Snow covered all. It smothered sound and distance. It smothered houses, streets, and human beings. It smothered life. Chapter 5. In the hall there was light and bustle. People were already arriving from the other hotels and chalets, their costumes hidden beneath many wraps. Groups of men in evening dress stood about smoking, talking snow and skiing. The band was tuning up. The claims of the hotel world clashed about him faintly as of old. At the big glass windows of the veranda, peasants stopped a moment on their way home from the cafe to peer. Hibbert thought laughingly of that conflict he used to imagine. He laughed because it suddenly seemed so unreal. He belonged so utterly to nature and the mountains, and especially to those desolate slopes where now the snow lay thick and fresh and sweet, that there was no question of the conflict at all. The power of the newly fallen snow had caught him, proving it without effort. Out there, upon those lonely reaches of the moonlit ridges, the snow lay ready, masses and masses of it, cool, soft, inviting. He longed for it. It awaited him. He thought of the intoxicating delight of skiing in the moonlight. Thus, somehow, in vivid, flashing vision, he thought of it while he stood there smoking with the other men and talking all the shop of skiing. And, ever mysteriously blended with this power of the snow, poured also through his inner being the power of the girl. He could not disabuse his mind of the insinuating presence of the two together. He remembered that queer skating impulse of 10 days ago, the impulse that had let her in. That any mind, even an imaginative one, could pass beneath the sway of such a fancy was strange enough, and Hibbert, while fully aware of the disorder, yet found a curious joy in yielding to it. This insubordinate center that drew him towards old pagan beliefs had assumed command. With a kind of sensuous pleasure he let himself be conquered. And snow that night seemed in everybody's thoughts. The dancing couples talked of it. The hotel proprietors congratulated one another. It meant good sport and satisfied their guests. Everyone was planning trips and expeditions, talking of slopes and telemarks, of flying speed and distance, of drifts and crusts and frost. Vitality and enthusiasm pulsed in the very air. All were alert and active, positive, radiating currents of creative life, even into the stuffy atmosphere of that crowded ballroom. And the snow had caused it, the snow had brought it. All this discharge of eager, sparkling energy was due primarily to the snow. But in the mind of Hibbert, some swift alchemy of his pagan yearnings, this energy became transmuted. It rarefied itself, gleaming in white in crystal's current of passionate anticipation, which he transferred, as by a species of electrical imagination, into the personality of the girl of the snow. She was somewhere, was waiting for him, expecting him, calling to him softly from those leagues of moonlight mountain. He remembered the touch of that cool, dry hand, the soft and icy breath against his cheek, the hush and softness of her presence in the way she came and the way she had gone again, like a flurry of snow the wind sent gliding up the slopes. She, like himself, belonged out there. He fancied that he heard her little windy voice come sifting to him through the snowy branches of the trees, calling his name, that haunting little voice that dived straight to the center of his life as once, long years ago, two other voices used to do. But nowhere among the costume dances did he see her slender figure. He danced with one and all, distrait and absent, a stupid partner as each girl discovered, his eyes ever turning toward the door and windows, hoping to catch the luring face, the vision that did not come, and at length, hoping even against hope. For the ballroom thinned, groups left one by one, going home to their hotels and chalets, the band tired, obviously, People sat drinking lemon squashes at their little tables, the men mopping their foreheads, everybody ready for bed. It was close on midnight. As Hibbert passed through the hall to get his overcoat and snow boots, he saw men in the passage by the sport room, greasing their skis against an early start. Knapsack luncheons were being ordered by the kitchen swing doors. He sighed. Lighting a cigarette a friend offered him, he returned a confused reply to some questions as to whether he could join their party in the morning. It seemed he did not hear it properly. He passed through the outer vestibule between the double glass doors and went into the night. The man who asked the question watched him go, an expression of anxiety momentarily in his eyes. "Don't think he heard you," said another, laughing. "You gotta shout to Hibbert, his mind's so full of his work." "He works too hard," suggested the first, full of queer ideas and dreams. But Hibbert's silence was not rudeness. He had not caught the invitation, that was all. The call of the hotel world had faded. He no longer heard it. Another wilder call was sounding in his ears. For up the street he had seen a little figure moving. Close against the shadows of the baker's shop it glided, white, slim, enticing. Chapter 6. And at once into his mind passed the hush and softness of the snow, yet with it a searching, crying wildness for the heights. He knew by some incalculable, swift instinct she would not meet him in the village street. It was not there, amid crowded houses, she would speak to him. Indeed, already she disappeared, melted from view up the white vista of the moonlit road. Yonder, he divined, she waited where the highway narrowed abruptly into the mountain path beyond the chalets. It did not even occur to him to hesitate, mad though it seemed and was, this sudden craving for the heights with her, at least for open spaces where the snow lay thick and fresh. It was too imperious to be denied. He does not remember going up to his room, putting the sweater over his evening clothes, and getting into the fur gauntlet gloves and the helmet cap of wool. Most certainly he has no recollection of fastening on his ski. He must have done it automatically. Some faculty of normal observation was in abeyance, as it were. His mind was out beyond the village, out with the snowy mountains and the moon. Henri Defago, putting up the shutters over the cafe windows, saw him pass and wondered mildly, "Un monsieur qui fait du ski à cette heure, il est anglais, Don," and shrugged his shoulders, as though a man had the right to choose his own way of death. And Martha Parati, the hunchback wife of the shoemaker, looked by chance from her window, caught his figure moving swiftly up the road. She had other thoughts, for she knew and believed the old traditions of the witches and snow beings that steal the souls of men. She had even heard, 'twas said, the dreaded synagogue pass roaring down the street at night, and now, as then, she hid her eyes. "They've called to him, and he must go," she murmured, making the sign of the cross. But no one sought to stop him. Hibbert recalls only a single incident until he found himself beyond the houses, searching for her along the fringe of forest where the moonlit met the snow in a bewildering frieze of fantastic shadows. And the incident was simply this, that he remembered passing the church. Catching the outline of its tower against the stars, he was aware of a faint sense of hesitation. A vague uneasiness came and went, jarred unpleasantly across the flow of his excited feelings, chilling exhilaration. He caught the instant's discord, dismissed it, and passed on. The seduction of the snow smothered the hint before he realized that it had brushed the skirts of warning. And then he saw her. She stood there waiting in a little clear space of shining snow, dressed all in white, part of the moonlight in the glistening background, her slender figure just discernible. "I waited, for I knew you would come," the silvery voice of the windy beauty floated down to him. "You had to come." "I'm ready," he answered. "I knew it too." The world of nature caught him in its heart in those few words, the wonder and the glory of the night and snow. Life leapt within him. The passion of his pagan soul exulted, rose in joy, flowed out to her. He neither reflected nor considered, but let himself go like the veriest schoolboy in the wildness of first love. "Give me your hand," he cried. "I'm coming." "A little further on, a little higher," came her delicious answer. "Here it is too near the village and the church." and the words seemed wholly right and natural. He did not dream of questioning them. He understood that, with this little touch of civilization in sight, the familiarity he suggested was impossible. Once out upon the open mountains, mid the freedom of huge slopes and towering peaks, the stars and moon to witness and the wildness of snow to watch, they could taste an innocence of happy intercourse free from the dead conventions that imprison literal minds. He urged his pace, yet did not quite overtake her. The girl kept always just a bit ahead of his best efforts, and soon they left the trees behind and passed on to the enormous slopes of the sea of snow that rolled in mountainous terror and beauty to the stars. The wonder of the white world caught him away. Under the steady moonlight, it was more than haunting. It was a living, white, bewildering power that deliciously confused the senses and laid a spell of wild perplexity upon the heart. It was a personality that cloaked and yet revealed itself through all the sheeted whiteness of snow. It rose, went with him, fled before, and followed after. Slowly it dropped lithe, gleaming arms about his neck, gathering him in. Certainly some soft persuasion coaxed his very soul, urging him ever forwards, upwards, on towards the higher icy slopes. Judgment and reason left their throne, it seemed, completely, as in the madness of intoxication. The girl, slim and seductive, kept always just ahead, so that he never quite came up with her. He saw the white enchantment from her face and figure, something that streamed about her neck, flying like a wreath of snow in the wind, and heard the alluring accents of her whispering voice that came from time to time. A little further on, a little higher, then we'll run home together. Sometimes he saw her hand stretched out to find his own, but each time, just as he came up with her, he saw her still in front, the hand and arm withdrawn. They took a gentle angle of ascent. The toil seemed nothing. In this crystal wine-like air, fatigue vanished. The shishing of the ski through the powdery surface of the snow was the only sound that broke the stillness. This, with his breathing and the rustle of her skirts, was all he heard. Cold moonshine, snow, and silence held the world. The sky was black, and the peaks beyond cut into it like frosted wedges of iron and steel. Far below the valley slept, the village long since hidden out of sight. He felt that he could never tire. The sound of the church clock rose from time to time faintly through the air, more and more distant. "Give me your hand. It's time now to turn back." "Just one more slope," she laughed, "the ridge above us, then we'll make for home." And her low voice mingled pleasantly with the purring of their ski. His own seemed harsh and ugly by comparison. "But I have never come so high before. It's glorious. This world of silent snow and moonlight. And you? You're a child of the snow, I swear. Let me come up closer to see your face and touch your little hand." Her laughter answered him. "Come on, a little higher. Here, we're quite alone together." "It's magnificent," he cried. "But why did you hide away for so long? I've looked and searched for you in vain ever since we skated." He was going to say 10 days ago, but the accurate memory of time had gone from him. He was not sure whether it was days or years or minutes. His thoughts of earth were scattered and confused. "You looked for me in the wrong places," he heard her murmur just above him. "You looked in places where I never go. Hotels and houses kill me. I avoid them." She laughed, a fine, shrill, windy little laugh. "I loathe them too." He stopped. The girl had suddenly come quite close. A breath of ice passed through his very soul. She had touched him. "But this awful cold," he cried out sharply, "this freezing cold that takes me. The wind is rising. It's a wind of ice. Come, let us turn." But when he plunged forward to hold her, or at least to look, the girl was gone again. And something in the way she stood there a few feet beyond and stared down into his eyes so steadfastly in silence made him shiver. The moonlight was behind her, but in some odd way he could not focus sight upon her face, although so close. The gleam of eyes he caught, but all the rest seemed white and snowy, as though he looked beyond her, out into space. The sound of the church bells came up faintly from the valley far below, and he counted the strokes. 5. A sudden, curious weakness seized him as he listened. Deep within it, deadly yet somehow sweet and hard to resist, He felt like sinking down upon the snow and lying there. They had been climbing for 5 hours. It was, of course, the warning of complete exhaustion. With a great effort, he fought and overcame it. It passed away as suddenly as it came. "We'll turn," he said with a decision he hardly felt. "It will be dawn before we reach the village again. Come at once. It's time for home." The sense of exhilaration had utterly left him. An emotion that was akin to fear swept coldly through him, but her whispering answer turned it instantly to terror, a terror that gripped him horribly and turned him weak and unresisting. "Our home is here." A burst of wild, high laughter, loud and shrill, accompanied the words. It was like a whistling wind. The wind had risen. The clouds obscured the moon. "A little higher, where we cannot hear the wicked bells," she cried, and for the first time seized him deliberately by the hand. She moved, was suddenly close against his face. Again she touched him. And Hibbert tried to turn away and escape, and so trying, found for the first time that the power of the snow, that other power which does not exhilarate but deadens effort, was upon him. The suffocating weakness that it brings to exhausted men, luring them to sleep of death in her clinging, soft embrace, lulling the will and conquering all desire for life. This was awfully upon him. His feet were heavy and entangled. He could not turn or move. The girl stood in front of him, very near. He felt her chilly breath upon his cheeks. Her hair passed blindingly across his eyes, and that icy wind came with her. He saw her whiteness close. Again it seemed. His sight passed through her, into space, as though she had no face. Her arms were around his neck. She drew him softly downward to his knees. He sank. He yielded utterly. He obeyed. Her weight was upon him, smothering, delicious. The snow was to his waist. She kissed him softly on the lips, the eyes, all over his face. And then she spoke his name in that voice of love and wonder, the voice that held the accent of 2 others, both taken over long ago by death, the voice of his mother and of the woman he had loved. He made one more feeble effort to resist. Then realizing, even when he struggled, that this soft weight about his heart was sweeter than anything life could ever bring, he let his muscles relax and sank back into the soft oblivion of the covering snow. Her wintry kisses bore him into sleep. Chapter 7. They say that men who know the sleep of exhaustion in the snow find no awakening on the hither side of death. The hours passed, and the moon sank down below the white world's rim. Then suddenly there came a little crash upon his breast and neck, and Hibbert woke. He slowly turned bewildered. Heavy eyes upon the desolate mountains stared dizzily about him, tried to rise. At first his muscles would not act. A numbing, aching pain possessed him. He uttered a long, thin cry for help, and heard its faintness swallowed by the wind. And then he understood vaguely why he was only warm, not dead. For this very wind that took his cry had built up a sheltering mound of driven snow against his body while he slept. Like a curving wave it ran beside him. It was the breaking of its overtoppling edge that caused the crash, and the coldness of the mass against his neck that woke him. Dawn kissed the eastern sky. Pale gleams of gold shot every peak with splendor. But ice was in the air, and the dry and frozen snow blew like powder from the surface of the slopes. He saw the points of his ski projecting just below him. Then he remembered. It seems he had just strength enough to realize that, could he but rise and stand, he might fly with terrific impetus toward the woods and village far beneath. The ski would carry him. But if he failed and fell? How he contrived it, Hibbert never knew. This fear of death somehow called out his whole available reserve force. He rose slowly, balanced a moment, then taking the angle of an immense zigzag, started down the awful slopes like an arrow from a bow. And automatically the splendid muscles of the practiced skier and athlete saved and guided him, for he was hardly conscious of controlling either speed or direction. The snow stung face and eyes like a fine steel shot. Ridge after ridge flew past. The summits raced across the sky. The valley leapt up with bounds to meet him. He scarcely felt the ground beneath his feet as the huge slopes and distance melted before the lightning speed of that descent from death to life. He took it in 4-mile-long zigzags, and it was the turning at each corner that nearly finished him, for then the strain of balancing taxed to the verge of collapse the remnants of his strength. Slopes that had taken hours to climb can be descended in a short half-hour on ski, but Hibbert had lost all count of time. Quite other thoughts and feelings mastered him in that wild, swift dropping through the air that was like the flight of a bird. For ever close upon his heels came following forms and voices with the whirling snow dust. He heard that little silvery voice of death and laughter at his back, shrill and wild. With the whistling of the wind past his ears, he caught its pursuing tones, but in anger now, no longer soft and coaxing. And it was accompanied. She did not follow alone. It seems a host of these flying figures of the snow chased madly just behind him. He felt them furiously smite his neck and cheeks, snatch at his hands and try to entangle his feet in ski and drifts. His eyes they blinded, and they caught his breath away. The terror of the heights and snow and winter desolation urged him forward in the maddest race with death a human being ever knew, and so terrific was the speed that before the gold and crimson had left the summits to touch the ice lips of the lower glaciers, he saw the friendly forest far beneath swing up and welcome him. And it was then, moving slowly along the edge of the woods, he saw a light. A man was carrying it. A procession of human figures was passing in a dark line laboriously through the snow, and he heard the sound of chanting. Instinctively, without a second's hesitation, he changed his course. No longer flying at an angle as before, he pointed his ski straight down the mountainside. The dreadful steepness did not frighten him. He knew full well it meant a crashing tumble at the bottom, but he also knew it meant a doubling of his speed, with safety at the end. For though no definitive thought passed through his mind, he understood that it was the village curé who carried that little gleaming lantern in the dawn, and that he was taking the host to a chalet on the lower slopes, to some peasant in extremis. He remembered her terror of the church and bells. She feared the holy symbols. There was one last wild cry in his ears as he started, a shriek of wind before his face, and a rush of stinging snow against closed eyelids, and then he dropped through empty space. Speed took sight from him. It seemed he flew off the surface of the world. Instinctively he recalls the murmur of men's voices, the touch of strong arms that lifted him, and the shooting pains as the ski were unfastened from the twisted ankle. For when he opened his eyes again to normal life, he found himself lying in his bed at the post office with the doctor at his side. But for years to come, the story of Mad Hibbert skiing at night is recounted in that mountain village. He went, it seems, up slopes, and to a height that no man in his senses ever tried before. The tourists were agog about it for the rest of the season, and the very same day 2 of the bolder men went over the actual ground and photographed the slopes. Later Hibbert saw these photographs. He noticed one curious thing about them, though he did not mention it to anyone. There was only a single track.